the taxes that we pay to one of the over 90,000 cities, counties, school districts, and other local units of government in the US. And the very sort of proliferation of localities, as I'll get into, is actually very significant to the story that I'm telling. And I'll also mention again that this is not an inconsequential portion of the total revenue that is brought in by governments within the US. Historically, local taxes, really right up until the 1930s, constituted upwards of 1/2 of all revenue collected by governments in the US. And today, it still accounts for nearly 1/4 of all taxes that Americans pay each year. Now, the taxes that local governments collect support some of the most vital needs and most essential features of a democratic society. K through 12 education, public safety, water and sanitation services, roads and transportation, public libraries, parks, playgrounds, so many of the sort of features about our lives as we navigate through Charlottesville and Albemarle County are very much dependent upon the revenues that local governments collect and the decisions they make on how to allocate those dollars. And of course, the main source of local government funding is the property tax, which in theory is a tax on all forms of property, tangible and intangible. And technically speaking, the property tax is a wealth tax. In fact, it's the only sort of wealth tax we have in the US. But in practice, it's become essentially a tax on land and homes, on real property. And my talk today is going to really focus on and look at the history of local taxation and the history of property taxes and how it has shaped and often undermined larger struggles for equality from the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, through the Jim Crow era and the modern civil rights movement, through the conservative counter-revolutions of the late 20th century and the onset of the era that we live in today. And I'll show how this tax is administered, not just the policies themselves, but how it's administered and enforced, and how its revenues are distributed is key to understanding how it came to play such a consequential role in so many of the issues, debates, and conflicts that have shaped American history and much of which we are familiar with. So let me start with the sort of period really where my book begins, and is also sort of where I see as really a pivotal moment in the history of sort of American taxation, the Civil War and Reconstruction. Just to kind of quickly sort of back up a bit, it's important to note like how starkly different the tax systems in the antebellum North and South were. Northern states and localities during the early 20th or early 19th century were developing relatively sort of sophisticated systems for collecting taxes and distributing revenues, and having much more sort of built out tax administrative apparatus that was more advanced and did a more effective job in both collecting taxes, doing so fairly, and also was much more, had much greater public spending. In contrast, the South, during the era of slavery, collected very little in taxes, had a very primitive system for determining sort of the assessed value of property for tax purposes, and it spent very little in the way of public goods and services. And one thing is the lack of that efficient and effective system for collecting public revenue actually became a liability for the South during the Civil War, one that sort of affected their ability to actually continue to sort of wage secession. And needless to say, Reconstruction state governments that were put in place at the end of the Civil War sharply broke with those tax policies and practices that characterized the antebellum South. Whereas antebellum state governments taxed land at very low rates, if they taxed it at all, under Reconstruction, Southern states began to increase those tax rates and began assessing property at its full value and worked to standardize these practices in order to bring in the revenue to meet the vast numbers of needs that they were tasked with addressing. Reconstruction governments were creating state agencies aimed at overseeing local tax administration, and empowering and working to sort of professionalize the practice of tax collection to ensure that it is being done accurately and fairly across jurisdictions. Some states also, during Reconstruction, aim to use tax policies as a means of redistributing land to the formerly enslaved in lieu of the federal government's failure to do so. In fact, the state of South Carolina established a land commission that was aimed specifically at sort of intentionally to break up some of the larger plantations and using failure to pay taxes as a sort of means of breaking up plantations and distributing land to African-American families. And of course, Reconstruction governments had a lot to offer, not just to formerly enslaved, but also to the vast numbers of poor whites in the South, those who had never owned slaves and who and for whom the slave system had deprived and impoverished them for generations. Reconstruction governments aimed to, were seeking to create a public educational system in the South that previously had not existed in any meaningful sense. They were creating a system of social welfare and social services for addressing not just the needs of freed men and women, but also for the large numbers of impoverished people across the region. Again, in a region that had many sort of needs to address in the wake of Civil War. But these same governments also imposed, really for the first time, taxes on the land and homes that were owned throughout the South, including those owned by many of the sort of not plantation owners, including many of the poor whites who, again, they were necessary to building a lasting coalition that could actually survive past the military withdrawal from the region. And this became the sort of a tactic that was being used by the South's ruling class in the aftermath of the Civil War to begin to win the loyalties of poor whites and ultimately build up enough strength to overturn Reconstruction governments. One of the things that began to proliferate across the South, of course, alongside of sort of terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, were these taxpayer leagues, which were often sort of formed and led by former slaveholders and Confederate generals, but were very much aimed at appealing to sort of mid-lane and poor whites and small landholders who now were sort of paying property taxes really for the first time, and sort of using to sort of stir up fears about and ultimately exploiting sort of ideas about sort of corrupt and incompetent administration in order to generate opposition to Reconstruction governments. And during this time as well, these sort of taxpayer leagues were really sort of creating this myth, one that African Americans, freedmen and women, paid no taxes and therefore had no claims on the state. And this became really, as I sort of argue, became one of the sort of pillars of, and the ideological pillars of what ultimately became the sort of Jim Crow fiscal state. This sort of myth that, one, that there were certain segments of the population that were not contributing to the public coffers, and repeating that myth regardless of the facts, but also then sort of constructing this idea that you had to sort of pay directly, or maybe even sort of the amount that you can expect or deserve in terms of public funds or public goods and services should be tied directly to the amount you are contributing into the system, which of course is not a system of taxation at all. It's more sort of a sort of fee for service, as it were. But nevertheless, these ideas about sort of who was deserving of public dollars and for what purposes, were being sort of circulated by these taxpayer leagues and really played a crucial role in overturning Reconstruction governments. And once we see the sort of so-called redemption of Southern states, you see soon after that very sharp reductions in the taxes being paid by some of the largest landholders and some of the wealthiest citizens across the South, and equally sharp funding cuts to public goods and services, especially public education. Just between 1870 and 1880 alone, the sort of decade that sees the sort of some of the last gasp of Reconstruction, as well as the sort of full-fledged sort sort of overturning of those governments. Between that 1 decade alone, per pupil spending on public education across the South fell by over 40%. So just a wholesale reduction in public spending and funding of public education. And along with these cuts were then followed soon after by southern states putting in place statutory limits on the ability of governments in the future to ever be able to increase taxes or spending going forward. Many of the new state constitutions that were being written after the end of Reconstruction put limits on like how much property could be taxed, how much taxes could be raised over any given year, and very much were aimed at sort of handcuffing the ability of future state governments to, regardless of who was in power, to ever be able to sort of increase public revenues. So, for instance, the state of Arkansas barred, wrote into their constitution limits on how much that the state legislature could not levy taxes above 1% of the assessed value of property. Period. Alabama had an even lower threshold of less than 0.75%. And Georgia passed a law that required any attempt by a local government to increase taxes needed to first get the support of over 2/3 of voters in a local election. So very much, again, sort of not just kind of slashing funding in the immediate sense, but working to change the sort of tax code in ways that would starve the state of the revenue it would ever need to be able to fund public goods and services in the future. Then lastly, and this I think is a crucial part of the sort of story my book tells, states at the same time gave local tax administrators really free rein over how they collected and enforced tax payments. Allowing sort of local tax assessors, contrast to some of the attempts by Reconstruction governments to professionalize the practice of tax assessments, removing many of those sort of standards, and instead allowing local tax assessors, giving them free rein to tax people's land as they saw fit, which, coupled with the disfranchisement laws that removed Black people from the political arena, meant that local tax assessors could overtax Black people, and specifically Black landowners, with virtual impunity, knowing that they would not be held to account by voters. So they did. By 1901, and I spent a lot of time over at the Library of Virginia going through a lot of tax rolls. By 1901, I could not find a single county in Virginia that was not over-assessing Black-owned acres of land relative to white-owned acres. In some counties, these disparities were extreme. And again, mind you here, I think the key sort of number here is what we know about the actual valuation of this property based on U.S. agricultural census reports that valued essentially the average market value of Black-owned acres in Virginia at this time at roughly 1/2 the value of an average white-owned acre, which also sort of reflects what we know about the land that was available to African Americans to acquire. Very little of the sort of richest farmland in the state was available to them. So again, keep that in mind here. Those are the sort of actual values, which should also then be reflected in the assessed value, which essentially an assessment is the value of property for the purposes of taxation. So again, this is something that oftentimes gets confused. Like an assessment is not the same as an appraisal. An assessment is specifically a term referring to the value of property for tax purposes. And oftentimes those values can be a fraction of the actual full value. But what you see here again is that what these numbers should look like is that each one of those numbers on the right in the African American column should be around half of what the numbers for white-owned acres were. Clearly they are not. And again, this was a pattern that played out throughout the post-Reconstruction South. In Georgia, one study found that land that was owned by the wealthiest property owners in the state enjoyed wholesale undervaluation, while the very small estates of the poor were systematically overvalued. Mississippi was particularly egregious in this practice, where the overtaxation of Black-owned land in some counties was upwards of 300% 50% higher than white-owned land.
Wow.
Which again, because of disfranchisement, these were tax bills that African Americans had very few practical means of contesting. And of course, for all the taxes that Black people paid, they received little to nothing in return. Their schools were obscenely underfunded. Their neighborhoods were grossly neglected. You know, you always knew you were entering a Black neighborhood in a southern town when the paved streets turned to dirt, when the sidewalks and streetlights disappeared, when sewer lines and storm pipes became open ditches. One of the practices that I found in southern towns as they were beginning to build out their civic infrastructure, beginning to actually sort of provide improvements in things such as water mains being laid throughout southern towns. It was a practice in southern towns, up to lay narrower water mains in Black neighborhoods. One case, which I'll get to here later, in the town of Shaw, Mississippi, it was found that the water mains on the Black side of town were 1.25 inches in diameter, whereas those on the white side of town were 5 inches.
Wow.
Meaning that the water pressure was very low in Black homes, and this was also coupled with the fact that there were very few fire hydrants on the Black side of town, which meant that when a fire broke out in an African-American owned home, it was very difficult to contain. And in fact, in 1 year alone in this town of Shaw, Mississippi, 7 houses burned to the ground and claiming 3 lives. Again, these were life and death consequences for the actions and decisions that were being made by local governments when it came to, again, their decisions on sort of how to allocate public dollars. And of course, nowhere were these patterns of neglect and the maldistribution of public dollars more evident than in the funding of public schools, which again is something that we're very well familiar with and was one of the sort of most visible features of Jim Crow society were the deprivation of African American schools. But I think one thing is also that important to note here is it was not just the sort of maldistribution of funds, but it was also the fact that the funds that were going toward white schools and oftentimes going toward the sort of more wealthiest white schools were actually coming directly out of Black people's pockets. So to give one example here from Virginia, Brunswick County down on the south side of Virginia, in the 1920s, they were spending on average $45 annually per white pupil in their public school systems. In contrast, they were spending only $3 per Black pupil. Now, at the time, this is a largely Black. African Americans constitute the majority of that county's population, and African American residents of Brunswick County were paying in direct tax payments they were supplying more than 1/4 of the county's school tax revenue. So think about this again. So they are paying 1/4 of the school tax revenue, and for that they're getting maybe I'm not sure. You do the math here. 45 to 3. That does not exactly add up to 1/4 of their just funds. And again, Jim Crow governments across the South were sort of robbing Black school funds at will. One study found in Mississippi, annual net transfers of Black tax dollars to white schools totaled over $1 million each year. Now, again, it's important to note here, though, that the public funds that were being essentially stolen from Black schools were not being shared equally amongst white school children. In fact, oftentimes some of these schemes were very much about funneling those dollars into the already most advantaged school systems, which oftentimes created a sort of a politics around taxes that could often be confused as just sort of straight up sort of kind of white supremacy, the interest of white supremacy, but oftentimes underneath it were kind of class politics amongst whites, essentially a battle amongst white Southerners over who got to enjoy the spoils of all the tax dollars that they were stealing from Black schools. So again, there was a lot of sort of things that were happening here as a result of essentially of the discretionary powers that these local tax administrators enjoyed and all the sort of forms of corruption and chicanery that this allowed for. And perhaps sort of the most egregious abuses and ones that really I spent about a third of my book talking about. My book is kind of sort of divided into sort of three different areas of tax policy administration. One is the assessment process, the ways in which taxes are collected, the ways in which these dollars are spent, and then lastly, how they're enforced. Now, all states have laws on the books that allow local tax authorities to place a lien on a property once it becomes tax delinquent. So if you don't pay your property taxes, you'll have a lien placed on your property, which if you do not sort of remove that, essentially operates as a cloud on your title. And if you don't, pay the debt you owe, which is usually also coupled with interest and fees on top of that, that local government can initiate a tax foreclosure and can sort of lose your property and all that it's worth for a single tax bill. Of course, these laws were also very ripe for abuse, especially if someone owned land that someone else, often someone with power and influence, wanted for themselves. And throughout this era, African American landowners, but not just them, but remained forever vulnerable to having their land taken from them through fraudulent tax sales. Writing in 1940, future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall described the tax sale as, quote, a practice and custom in the South of depriving Negroes of their property through subterfuge. Marshall, while working for the NAACP, found examples of property being steered into tax delinquency without its owner's knowledge, and then being quietly sold without their notice. And he also found that there was a pattern to these practices. It happened, as he wrote, quote, to Negroes who owned property which became enhanced in value either through a real estate development or expansion of business areas. And I recount numerous examples of individuals, and in one case, an entire town, entire African-American town, that having their land essentially legally stolen from them through tax sales. So, in my book, and I think in my work more broadly, I really am calling for a kind of a wholesale rethinking of what it meant to live under Jim Crow. And I see that it was not so much the indignity of being forced to drink from a colored water fountain or sit in a colored section of a train or at the back of the bus, no matter how sort of humiliating and unjust those practices were. The foremost minds of many African Americans living under Jim Crow, what that meant was the threat of being sickened from untreated water or sewage, of dying in a house fire for lack of fire hydrants or water pressure. It was, their children having to attend school in a dilapidated structure, often for only half a day because they did not provide enough teachers to educate a full complement of school children. And often those schools closing or not opening until the cotton was harvested in the fall and closing as soon as it came time to plant it in the spring. It was also, again, the experience of Jim Crow was the threat of having your land or home stolen by fraudulent means. And of course, of being forced to pay taxes in support of services, protections, and improvements that you were denied. Now, throughout these years, African Americans were fighting relentlessly to end these abuses and fighting for their fair share of the public's money. So many of these indignities and injustices that Black Southerners suffered under Jim Crow, had their origins in the sort of budgetary decisions of white-controlled local governments, and as a result, so many of the issues that drew people into the movement, so many of the items on local movements' agendas concern matters of local taxation and public spending. You just have to kind of look closely and see here, how much of what was actually sort of driving people and what were the sort of issues at the forefront of the demands of local organizations in city and town and counties throughout the South were very much centered around these matters having to do with local governance, taxes, and public spending. One story I think I include that kind of tries to hammer this point home is the story of James Farmer, who was actually one of the lead organizers of the 1963 March on Washington. But he was not standing on the steps of the Lincoln Monument that August afternoon. He was instead sitting in a jail cell in Plaquemine, Louisiana, having been arrested days earlier while protesting the town's refusal to extend sewer lines into black neighborhoods. In the small town of Edwards, Mississippi, which I write about in my book, African-American residents staged a year-long boycott of local white-owned businesses beginning in 1966 that was aimed at forcing town officials to provide them with the same basic services it was providing white residents, like sewer lines, sidewalks, paved streets, garbage service, and access to the town's swimming pool, all of which their tax dollars had helped to pay for. And in retaliation for a remarkably successful boycott that really crippled local white-owned businesses, town officials punished those black residents by systematically raising, often doubling, the tax assessments on every black-owned home in town, except for those who did not honor the boycott. They just went right through the town's property tax ledgers and adjusted the tax bill of every black resident who took part in the boycott. This is, and again, you can see here just how egregious this was. This was some of the evidence was presented in the federal case challenging this is unconstitutional. Here again, these two homes received the exact same tax bill in 1967. And again, this was the case here in Edwards. This was one of the more egregious examples of what I found was an all too common practice that was being used against persons who challenged segregation and white supremacy during these years. In Sunflower County, Mississippi, local officials cut off water service and removed the tax exemption from Fannie Lou Hamer's church in Ruleville. Little Rock, Arkansas activist Daisy Bates had the tax assessment on her home jacked up following the desegregation of Central High in 1957. And it's important to note here that none of these victims could find justice through the courts, and nor could they find justice through the courts today. That's because of the 1937 Tax Injunction Act, which effectively closed the federal courthouse doors to victims of unfair taxation by state and local officials. Again, one of the sort of elements of the civil rights movement was expanding federal power and authority to check the abuses of local governments throughout the South. Of course, the rallying cry of Southern resistance was states' rights to sort of limit that reach. Well, one area that was not touched at all were local tax matters. In fact, again, there were statutory barriers against you filing a federal lawsuit challenging abusive and discriminatory practices by local tax officials. Now, again, this was something that was also being challenged. As a result of the Edwards case, attorneys for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law filed a federal lawsuit on behalf of Edwards black residents against town officials over this flagrant abuse of their tax powers to punish black protesters. But the case of Bland versus McCon was dismissed in federal court, and those exorbitant tax bills remained on the books. During these same years, another small town in Mississippi that I write about became the center of the legal fight for equality in public services. In 1967, lawyers for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund filed a lawsuit on behalf of Andrew and Mary Lou Hawkins against the town of Shaw, Mississippi. Again, the town I mentioned that just collected black tax dollars, had a general revenue fund, but spent none of them on black neighborhoods. Again, like this, the sort of findings from this case were just, so egregious. I mean, just, again, like, like one side of the town has these nice, like, sort of nice brand new street lights, swimming pool, paved streets, paved sidewalks, and you just, cross over the river and it's just like night and day. Yet even, again, this is all within the same municipality. In this case, resulted in a landmark ruling in Hawkins v. Shaw, which established the principle of equality in public services. At the time, this was actually being sort of hailed by some of the civil rights community as like almost like equivalent to the Brown versus Board of Education decision in terms of its implications for how local governments are responsible for equal equality in public services. And as I also sort of show, I mean, local taxes were really also at the center of another key, struggle of the civil rights movement, which was the fight to protect and save African American owned land, which was being lost at a dramatic rate during the very same decades in which Jim Crow was being dismantled. Between 1950 and 1970, African Americans in the South were annually losing over 340,000 acres of land. In Mississippi alone, over 13,000 Black families were rendered landless during those 2 decades. Much of this land was being gobbled up by large-scale agribusiness or by land speculators and developers. Places like coastal South Carolina, areas along the Sea Islands that have been home to communities of Black landowning families since the dawn of emancipation were rapidly becoming vacation resorts and golf courses. And tax sales were one of those mechanisms in which that land was being transferred from one hand to another. In Mississippi, it was found that upwards of 1,500 Black-owned family farms and homes were being lost in tax sales each year. Wow. And again, these rising rates of tax delinquency were due to many factors. I mean, the prices that farmers could command for their crops were falling, the cost of running small-scale operations were rising, and taxes were rising further still. And oftentimes, local governments, especially those who had a vested interest in promoting real estate development, and the sort of spoils that came with that, oftentimes were very keen to put their thumb on the scale and sort of in assessing land at the highest rate, knowing that those owners would struggle to be able to pay that and would often be forced to sell that land under duress. And so out of that, there's a sort of an untold story here of the civil rights movement, after the media left and after Freedom Summer, that continued well into the 1970s. It was being waged by groups like Black Land Services, which was founded on St. Helena Island in South Carolina at the Penn Center, which was a sort of civil rights organizing center. They identified early on, like this was reaching a crisis level, and began sort of creating services aimed at sort of helping families that were in danger of falling into tax delinquency, helping them know what their legal rights were, ways in which they could get tax exemptions on their land, ways they could put it to profitable use before it became profitable to someone else. Region-wide, the Emergency Land Fund grew up in the 1970s and were very much sort of focused across the South and working in, especially in rural southern counties, to identify the properties that were falling into tax delinquency, and oftentimes sort of intervening directly. I found this image here again of probably oftentimes to the shock and dismay of the people who were accustomed to going to these tax sales and just gobbling up whatever land they wanted. And oftentimes never saw a Black face in any of these spaces. Suddenly, you have African Americans who are going there, competing against some of these large-scale land grabbers and trying to sort of claw back land that was in danger of being lost. So, as this is happening, and again, I'll sort of pivot here to sort of the other aspect of my book, which is very much focused on the fight for freedom in the North. Which was similarly being fought on fiscal grounds. One of the things that I find, even as African Americans are migrating by the millions into northern cities in the mid-20th century, you're seeing this other separate development unfolding, which is the growth of suburbs. And in particular, not just the sort of the growth of suburbs, but also the proliferation of suburban municipalities, school districts, and local governments. These sort of maps over here, this is for Cook County, Chicago, just kind of illustrate just how many of these are just sort of cropping up. And this had real consequences for the funding of vital public goods and services in cities, and as well on tax rates for lower income homeowners and neighborhoods. As middle-class whites, businesses and industries are leaving central cities, they're taking their tax dollars with them. They're forming new municipalities and school districts, and often very much resisting cities' attempts to annex them, and oftentimes sort of creating these real disparities between the cities and suburbs in terms of their fiscal capacity. And kind of creating what I sort of describe, this is a slide I often use in some of my classes where I'm sort of explaining these dynamics of this kind of vicious cycle in which you are seeing sort of cities not just being drained of people and businesses, but also seeing their own tax bases be drained, which then in turn, again, leads to both diminished public services, which of course then sort of incentivizes even more people who have the ability to leave. And also then again is sort of leading to this sort of downward deterioration of especially urban school systems as well as many other social services. And at the same time, we could sort of flip this around and say it was creating a virtuous cycle in many of the more advantaged suburbs, in that essentially this system as it was set up is creating one in which if you're living in a place with a lot of high value property, a lot of and say relatively few numbers of people, you will be able to enjoy lower taxes and much better services. In comparison, what's happening in cities during this very same time is that urban residents, and especially the poorest neighborhoods, are seeing their effective tax rates increase at the same time as the quality of their schools, their streets, their parks and playgrounds are all suffering from underfunding. And this again is, was part of the sort of fiscal logic of urban governments during this time period. Realizing that middle-class white households and businesses had mobility. They could leave. They had that exit option, whereas many African Americans in low-income neighborhoods were oftentimes. Sorry. Are oftentimes at the same time, don't have that same ability, and therefore do not have, or oftentimes, those where local tax assessors would often find ways to sort of tax these neighborhoods more heavily, knowing that the political fallout would be minimal. And this, is also, again, one of the things that I sort of found looking more closely at this sort of era of what came to be known as the urban crisis, one that was very much a sort of fiscal crisis, was that this was also not playing a not insignificant role in fueling the unrest that led to large-scale uprisings in many cities during the 1960s. Some of you might be familiar with the Kahrl report that came out in 1968, which was this study commissioned by the Johnson administration to understand the underlying sources of unrest and were leading to riots in numerous cities during these years. And one of the things that sort of stood out to me in reading through that report is, they list at the outset in the introduction, like the main grievances that they were able to sort of identify from all these interviews and surveys that they were doing in cities that were beset by unrest. And one thing that was noticeable to me is that 5 of those 12 main grievances that were identified by the Kahrl Commission concerned matters of local governance and public spending. Again, inadequate schools, inadequate streets, underfunded neighborhoods, lack of parks and playgrounds in Black neighborhoods. I mean, these coupled with, again, the sort of abusive practices of police. I mean, all these things were, again, sort of very much, again, part of a national pattern, but were also being experienced and constituted through local governance. And, at the same time, as you are seeing that unrest on the streets, you are also seeing organized campaigns to channel that towards structural change, being led by people like the famed community organizer Saul Alinsky, who launched the Citizens Action Program in Chicago, which was aimed at forcing the city to tax its major industries what they owed, and reduce the crippling tax burdens that poor homeowners face. So again, that was another key element here. Cities as industries are threatening to leave and relocate, they're using that as a way to sort of get generous tax reductions that are, again, also sort of reducing the size of tax bases. I talk a lot about the anti-poverty activist George Wiley, who in 1973 formed what was known as the Movement for Economic Justice, whose mission was, as he saw it, was to unite working and middle-class whites and African Americans who were all being squeezed by rising costs, and get them to sort of see that they had sort of common sort of interest, and particularly, common interest in fixing this broken tax system, one that allowed the wealthy to evade their tax obligations, one that starved vital public goods and services of funds, and often, again, forced average American households and the poor to foot the bill. These taxpayer-led movements were in the 1970s, as I sort of showed. I mean, what came to be the sort of known as the sort of this era of tax revolts in the 70s actually really began on the left and was being led by these sort of grassroots movements on the political left that were seeking structural reforms to local tax systems that, again, sort of grossly undertaxed the wealthy and large businesses and overtaxed the poor. And it often, again, fought for tax cuts that would be, also coupled with, spending increases on the vital goods and public services that communities needed. But these movements often failed to achieve results in terms of policy change. As they continued to sort of run up against any sort of action in Congress or at the state level, I argue that they really created an opening for that sort of anti-tax political right to exploit, to essentially sort of utilize this unrest and these pocketbook concerns and the demand for relief to then sort of push through extreme draconian measures that were aimed at essentially cutting taxes across the board, and whose greatest beneficiaries would be those who were already the most advantaged. And that sort of began in California in 1978 with the passage of Prop 13, a ballot initiative that reduced property tax assessments across the board, and kind of, again, similar to what southern states were doing after Reconstruction, handcuffed state and local governments from ever increasing those assessments in the future, even as sort of property values might change, dramatically. This significantly shrank local tax bases. It decimated local budgets. Public schools across the state of California went from being some of the best funded to some of the worst funded public schools in America almost overnight. This is often as well credited with really sort of fueling the rise of Ronald Reagan and the sort of political turn in the 1980s. And it was also reflected in states across the country. Between 1978 and 1983, 20 states enacted kind of measures that were similar to California's, although not as extreme, but oftentimes very much sort of limiting the ability of local governments to essentially, tax property to reflect its actual value. And this, again, sort of really worked to kind of lock in some of these existing disparities and created these sort of perverse incentives on the part of local governments. As they became more dependent upon their local housing markets for revenue, because another element of what was happening in the 1980s were the Reagan administration was enacting sharp cuts to funding to cities. Cities were aggressively undertaxing, say, areas that they wanted to see developed and wanted to sort of become engines of sort of economic growth, while at the same time sort of grossly overtaxing some of the poorest neighborhoods in those cities. I use the example of Jersey City, New Jersey, which was awarding sort of these massive tax subsidies to waterfront developers by essentially sort of freezing property taxes at these artificially low rates. In fact, they went 15 years without adjusting the assessed value of waterfront property at a time where the actual value of this property was going through the roof. And again, those taxes will also remain frozen in some of the poorer neighborhoods of the city. But again, as those assessments remained frozen, the actual tax burdens of lower income neighborhoods were increasing. And so again, this, Jersey City is one of many cities where these local issues and these local concerns were fueling protests and movements that oftentimes escaped national attention, but added up were really important elements of the sort of struggle for equality at the urban level in the late 20th century. So I'll just kind of, and also, again, I'll sort of, just to conclude here as well, another very much ongoing problem is how this tax structure continues to compel some of the poorest, most fiscally famished cities and counties to raise revenue by preying on their own citizens, whether it be through the aggressive use of fines and fees to generate revenue, something that the Justice Department really uncovered in the report on Ferguson, Missouri, that came out in 2015, when it was found that Ferguson, which was the site of a major protest and following the police killing of Michael Brown, it was found that essentially that city's police department was essentially operating as a tax collector. I mean, just essentially raising revenue through arrests and fines. And that's one sort of symptom of this. Another is local governments selling tax liens on tax delinquent properties to private investors and finding ways to incentivize investing through raising the interest rates that they could charge on these debts, allowing them to add on all manner of fees that'll again increase the profitability of this form of essentially predatory investing, while at the same time sort of extracting ever more amounts of revenue from some of the poorest communities in those cities. So I'll just kind of conclude by saying, we have a lot of problems in America today. And I would say that all of these problems require collective solutions. We need to massively reinvest in public institutions. Our physical and civic infrastructure is crumbling from decades of neglect. We of course need to confront the challenges of a warming planet and its catastrophic effects. But in order to do that, we need a tax system that doesn't reinforce the very problems, inequities, and injustices that these public investments aim to combat. And I would argue that America's localized system of taxation is one of those forces of inequality and division. It works in practice to reinforce and enhance the political and financial advantages enjoyed by some, while compounding the problems and challenges faced by the poor and disadvantaged. It's a system that in practice taxes those who have the most, the least, and ensures that they get the lion's share of the public goods and services that local governments provide. And at the same time, it taxes those who have the least the most, and imposing often the heaviest burdens while providing the fewest benefits to those in need. And I'll say that until we address these structural features of our tax system, it will continue to fuel inequality and frustrate attempts to combat it through other means. So I'll sort of welcome your thoughts, questions, and thank you for coming in and listening.
Can you go back to the Jersey slide?
Yeah.
Oh, right. And then you said something that I didn't understand. You said for 15 years, taxes were held steady. You said
Assessments were
held steady for the wealthy and the poorer neighborhoods. And you said assessments held steady, but then you said, and so it was a benefit, but then you said comma, but.
So let me explain how.
Yeah, you said a sentence in there.
So let me explain what's going on here.
Yeah,
and this is an example of the devil in the details here. Okay. So again, there are no, every state has different requirements on when assessments need to be updated. So some states require it every year. Some states every 4 years. New Jersey has no requirements whatsoever. Like, it's entirely at the discretion of local governments on when they update those assessments. So think about it, the longer you go in between updating those tax assessments, that means that people who own homes or property that increases in value, the longer you go without updating them, the more of the tax break they're getting. Versus, again, people who are living in areas where property values are stagnant or even decreasing, that means that ultimately their property constitutes a larger share of the overall tax base, which then results in not just the taxes remaining the same, but in fact, actually, what they are doing is increasing the tax rate over time. So again, there's two elements here. The assessed value of the property is one thing, but then how much you pay in property taxes is the assessed value times the tax rate. And so if the tax rate increases, but the assessed value stays the same, that means essentially the taxes are increasing in poor neighborhoods while decreasing effectively in these areas where property values are increasing. When in fact, if they were actually assessing accurately, that wealthy waterfront property would be paying a much larger share of the overall, tax burden. Is that?
Okay, so the,
Yeah.
the multiplier, they call it the coefficient changed. So the assessed value, but you said the tax rate, the devil was in the details. That rate, the point,
As long as you're not,
0.07 or 0.72, whatever, kept changing.
as long as you're not updating, as long as the assessments remain the same, the longer that goes on, that inherently advantages people who own property that's increasing in value because it's not being reflected in their tax bill.
Right.
At the same time, it inherently disadvantages people whose property value is not increasing or even decreasing. Does that make sense? So again, like that's one of these things where inaction is a form of action. An action, again, that is, advantaging some at the expense of others. Which again is a product of the fact that there's no sort of standardized requirements. And I should also add here that even if states have laws on the books that require them to be updated, many studies have found in practice, oftentimes they're just copying, from year to year. So I mean, that's another problem here is actually how do you sort of enforce and ensure that those assessments actually reflect the actual value. Yeah.
So let me answer. Excellent presentation. Clearly you did a lot of work. At the end of all of this, what do you see happening? What do you see, what recommendations specifically would you make? Because you talk about this situation where the taxes have been, I was in construction lending throughout the United States, these property taxes remaining stable. It's a wonderful idea, public-private partnerships. How are you going to get land developed when it's so expensive, so highly assessed, no one's coming in? Or you go into situations where I've been involved in where everyone's talking, oh, we're going to keep this way and the taxes are going to be this way. It can't survive because of local governments or whatever. Once the edifice goes up for affordable housing or whatever, it's no longer affordable. So what do you recommend? Because I see all little pieces of everything you're talking about currently existing and no one doing anything about it.
Well, I think part of it is because what I'll say is one is like, these are problems that local governments alone can't solve because in a sense, the sort of localized fragmented nature of it is part of the problem. I would say that I'm not opposed to property taxes in theory. I think that actually, again, like I said at the outset, I mean, it's really the only sort of tax on wealth we have in this country. But in practice, oftentimes, property taxes have become effectively a tax on housing that consume an ever greater share of the income of low-income households compared to wealthier ones. And as well, the sort of various ways in which localities are in competition with each other for development, for business and industries, are constantly in this sort of playing this game of trying to adjust and use taxes as an incentive, as a way, which can lead to a sort of race to the bottom, which oftentimes, again, advantages those who have the greatest mobility, the greatest sort of ability to use their leverage to gain tax advantages. And all of these things add up to, at the end of the day, the poorest and most disadvantaged, the least mobile, are left holding the bag, and are certainly the goods and services that they might rely on are oftentimes the first to get on the chopping block.
In your presentation, it was clear. I'm looking at New York City right now. All of these taxes that are being imposed, and the wealthy can pick up and leave.
So New York City might be a different case, but
it has some, but whatever, in your presentation, as the people that can afford leave the cities for whatever the reason, that there are those that are not quite so mobile, they stay. There's not a revenue base any longer. So you're just creating tomorrow's ghettos today.
So one thing, and again, I am not I'm a historian. My job is to explain how we got here. It's for all of us. But I will point this out. I will make this point. We are the only federated nation in the world, meaning one that has these multiple levels of governance. We're the only federated nation in the world that does not have some system of fiscal equity amongst lower units of government. So like in Canada, in Germany, in Australia, you have systems in place to ensure that the most fiscally famished localities will have the revenue they need to be able to provide the goods and services that their citizens rely on, which we sort of define as being like essential to a healthy, advanced, democratic society. I mean, to give one example here, from recent headlines, which is actually where the story I end my book on, the Jackson, Mississippi water crisis, where you have the largest city in a state. The state capital literally does not have enough revenue to even keep its water system running. And that was entirely, I mean, there was nowhere they could turn to raise the funds that they needed to be able to update and repair their water system. And as a result, an entire major city in the US has its water system collapse. And similarly, if you look at, and this is something.
Who manages these things? I mean, we vote for people, presumably hired people that know what they're doing. And if you don't.
This wasn't a case of necessarily this wasn't so much mismanagement, it was just the fiscal realities that this city had seen its entire sort of exodus of middle-class white homeowners and businesses to the suburbs that had their own tax bases and just, they had perfectly good drinking water and great, well-funded schools, and essentially left this central city without any sort of means of generating revenue on its own. The state was not providing any assistance. There was no means in which the federal government could sort of come in outside of, say, emergency relief. And so again, this is the kind of predictable endpoint of a system that we live under right now, and we shouldn't be surprised that these things happen. And even the best-run cities might find themselves in these types of situations because of the way that the structure is designed. It's designed as well, again, and of course, anyone who's living in a city like Jackson, Mississippi, who has the means to leave, of course they're going to leave. The streets are crumbling, the water isn't even reliable. And that, of course, then just drains the tax base even further. So again, that sort of vicious cycle here is just a natural byproduct.
I'm missing something here.
Yeah.
The people are leaving why?
Well,
Because they don't have sidewalks.
yeah.
No, we're talking about there are cities, there
Well-
are people that have means and no means.
Well-
In your presentation, the people that have means leave.
Mhm.
So why are the people that have means leaving?
Well, for
Why
one,
not try to retain them so that they can continue?
well, and this is an argument that's used by sort of a school of economists who say that actually the ways that these cities should respond is by providing targeted enhanced services to the most already advantaged and most mobile segments of the population. So, again, pave the streets in the white neighborhoods so the white folks stay.
Well, that's not fair.
well,
I mean,
but that's-
it should be your
James
first
Buchanan,
position expand it for
argued.
everyone. Yeah.
Well, but I mean, that was, again, if you only have a limited amount of revenue and you are facing the prospect of a continued sort of exodus of the sort of largest taxpayers, then the fiscal sort of logical response is just funnel money to these neighborhoods and screw the folks who are living in the poor neighborhoods, which is kind of what they were doing in the 1960s and 70s informally. In fact, I find examples of some folks who were saying, quite frankly, it's yeah, we're overtaxing these neighborhoods because they can't go anywhere. And that was part of. And again, this isn't just an unjust system.
We learn
Yeah.
from that. Now
Yeah.
let's fix it. We know what happened, so and maybe we keep the people there
Yeah.
in town.
Mhm.
And it's not just apportioning the monies to the rich, apportion it to the whole thing, because we recognize why people are leaving.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Have you seen any innovative approaches by any communities to address the problem of visa inequity
Yeah. I mean, in terms in the present day or.
in the present day?
I mean, I think, what we're, it's interesting. I mean, we're seeing right now in New York, efforts to tax, second home properties that are owned by people who don't live in, second homes. I think, one of the things that I am, in some of the wealthiest real estate, I would say, I mean, one of the things that I think is actually, if we're talking about this sort of tax side, not the spending side, I think that, one tool that localities have that I think should be utilized wherever possible are circuit breakers, which essentially are ensure that property taxes will not rise above a certain amount of a person's income. So, people are not facing the prospect of being taxed out of their homes. So essentially sort of, using that as a way to sort of ensure that you're not going to be paying property taxes above a certain percentage, and ensuring then that, at the very least, it's a sort of protection against some of the worst and most egregious abuses of this system. Again, the sort of ways in which you see speculators and developers sort of hone in on neighborhoods where people are on fixed or low incomes, struggling to hold on to their property, but seeing gentrification unfolding. So that's, I think that's one measure. But again, with regards to on the spending side, I mean, all of these problems became so much worse after Reagan just decimated revenue sharing in the 1980s. I mean, cities were getting it, it was not in any way sort of adequate to make up for some of these disparities, but there was a significant amount of revenue was going to localities through the federal government, and much of that was ended in the 1980s under the Reagan administration, which just made all of these disparities so much greater, and also made these kind of practices like preying on your own citizens for revenue, pocketbook policing, as it's sort of known, made all of it sort of more pervasive, because there was really nowhere else to turn. So again, I think one thing here is like reinvesting in our local communities, because one thing that we know is like, if the property tax is a wealth tax, and one thing we know is that wealth is very unevenly distributed across this country. Again, there are some parts of the country, Silicon Valley, for instance, where we have a lot of wealth concentrated, a lot of wealth and property concentrated, versus other places, again, that, no matter.
Hi, I'm sorry to interrupt. The center closes at 7, so if you all wouldn't mind exiting out the side door, that'd be fine. You can go as long as you want.
Oh, okay.
But just if you'll just go out the side door instead of the front door, it'll still bring you out.
Where
to
is the side door?
Point to the side door.
Where is the side door?
The side door, when you go down to the main entrance, go to your right, go all the way to the end of the hall, and then to your left.
Okay,
The right.
go to the right.
Yeah, I'll have a sign that points the way.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
don't worry, you'll get out. Thank you very much.
All right.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if that answered your question, but yeah, I think again, like reinvesting in our communities is always a good way to sort of lessen some of these problems at the very least. Yeah.
So I'm originally from Montgomery, Alabama,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean I grew up just as early as the 90s, and some of the things that you talk about that are from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s are still very much happening today.
Mm-hmm.
Like we growing up, had a joke of white flight, leaving the city, going to these new suburbs where everything is nice, everything is new. And it was, when I was born, Montgomery was 320,000 people. Now Montgomery hovers somewhere around 190, 200,000 people, and that's in 35 years. How do you see localities, and this sort of takes away from out of your historian side and sort of into current affairs, how do you see, I don't see it as a generational shift, because we can now see that some of the new generation is doing some of the same things that the old generation has, and sometimes even worse. How do governments, how do policymakers, what are ways to sort of combat this? What are ways to get back at it, to not just get right back into gentrification, where we take these old neighborhoods and cities, somebody comes and lands grabs it, makes it nice, but then it's no longer being able to be used by the people that have inhabited that for years and years and years.
Yeah.
And then another part is this map right here was extremely interesting to me. And I saw it one way at the beginning, but now seeing it at the end of your presentation, I see it a completely different way. From some of the large localities that have large land areas versus the north, where all of these very micro localities, how do you see them interacting together versus what some of the northern states are doing good and doing wrong, and then the same thing for the South, doing right and doing wrong?
Yeah, I mean,
what's a land area?
Yeah, I mean, one of the sort of things here that's notable, and you probably know this from growing up in Alabama, is that in contrast to the north, with regards to public school systems, which, again, as I sort of talked about in Chicago, I mean, there is just hundreds of school districts in Metro Chicago, similarly in Detroit. I mean, that was part of this sort of draw of moving out to the suburbs, was not just this sort of, owning a home that will increase in value, and it will increase in value because of the people who live there and also who doesn't get to live there, but also the ability to sort of have well-funded schools for relatively low taxes. In contrast, in the South, oftentimes, and this is part of this sort of reasons why you had explicit racial segregation within one school system, because most Southern school systems were countywide. That's beginning to change in places. I know, I'm not sure about Montgomery, but I know in many larger cities, you're seeing now this sort of separatism, like formation of separate school districts, in a sense, kind of sort of replicating the pattern that, in which segregation in schools was carried out in the North, is now sort of visiting itself in Southern locales. One of the most, as I argue, one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions regarding school funding, which again is not the sort of sole factor here that is driving segregation, but it is not an insignificant one, was the case of San Antonio versus Rodriguez. This was a case challenging the constitutionality of a funding scheme that is entirely access to public education is entirely reliant upon the value of the property within the locale in which a person lives, resulting in these, in the case centered around the fact that in San Antonio, you had, on one side of town, this very wealthy white school district, predominantly white school district that had ample funds, like Olympic swimming pool, everything you could ask for. And then across town, you have this sort of this sort of very poor school district. It was like the one that nobody annexed, so it was just kind of left onto their own devices, and they had no revenue. And no matter how much they raised taxes, they would never have the revenue they needed to be able to educate the children within that school system. And the schools were falling apart. They couldn't afford textbooks, there was rats, and all kinds of horrible problems that this school system faced, and they had no way out of it. And so that case was saying, like, they were challenging whether or not this whole scheme was constitutional. Like, if education's a right, we need to figure out a different way to fund public schools that doesn't allow for these vast disparities. California actually sort of had a case in there that actually did rule it unconstitutional and sort of found a more equitable way of distributing public funding there. But in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court upheld this funding scheme. It was a real sort of turning point. I mean, I say that if Brown versus Board of Education opened the door for equality in public education, the San Antonio versus Rodriguez and the Milliken v. Bradley, which was addressing a different but still related problem, that those decisions slammed that door shut, and we're still living under that sort of these issues to this day. And it really now has been reduced to big problems that states have to solve. And there have been states that have tried to set up schemes whereby you can have sort of school dollars being channeled toward these very underfunded school districts, which again is not just exclusive to predominantly black school districts at all. I mean, like, I'm from Ohio, and the case there that came before the Ohio Supreme Court, very, very wisely, I think, it was a lawsuit that was filed by both an urban school district in Cleveland and a very impoverished school district in Appalachia. So kind of showing here, like, this is something that's affecting poor whites in rural counties. My sister is actually a school teacher in one of the most underfunded school districts in Ohio. And again, like, even though they won that court case, there's been very limited action since then. I mean, it's still, so it's been a real, there's not easy solutions here. But I think one thing I'm trying to do with this work is actually putting new questions on the table and maybe sort of showing that there's things that we're not really not thinking about that we should be. And I think the structure is a huge thing that has kind of been sort of too oftentimes sort of invisible to these sort of policy debates.
Oh, I was gonna say, I think we probably need to wrap up, but thank you again.
As everybody is walking out the door, I just want to give you my little pitch. I'm currently the president and chair of the board of the Historical Society. We have some